So I've already talked to you about porn and masturbation and how you shouldn't be doing either because they're very harmful to you. I mean, unless you want to see yourself with a diaper fetish 5 years down the line like the freak you are. But I wanted to talk about some of the sexual pathologies that arise from them themselves and how to treat them, because the medical community and that whole sphere of things is not well equipped to do that, and I don't think they're genuinely interested in helping people either. I mean, I think that's evident in the way that transsexualism is being treated right now. I mean, they found about one thing about it that's approximating correct, which is gender dysphoria, which is the dissatisfaction that a transsexual feels about their biological sex and is the driving factor behind wanting to be the opposite sex. But the way that they have devised to treat it is by making the people transition, and I think that's catastrophic for two reasons. First of all, because I don't think turning men into women and vice versa is really a solution to anything, and second of all, because there's a study done in Sweden of about 300 sex reassigned people that were surveyed over the course of 30 years, and there is a lot of findings to suggest that transitioning is very bad, but I think the most important one is that it actually increases suicidality, which, explains the whole suicide rates thing. So transitioning is really not ideal, and I think should be avoided at all costs because it's basically just enabling mental illness. I think to properly treat it, we have to look at transsexualism in a different light, and that starts with a thing called body dysmorphic disorder, which I found out about a little while ago. And it's basically a disorder where a person will perceive some aspect or portion of their body as inherently flawed and will get a lot of dissatisfaction from it, and will go to extensive measures to hide or remove the feature, and this can result in eating disorders and anorexia and a bunch of different things. And I think reading personal accounts of what gender dysphoria is like, it's a very similar thing. The perceived flaws are one's biological sex traits, like let's say it's a male to female transsexual. Things like body hair, muscle tissue, facial bone structure, they'll see these things as problematic, and the extensive measures that they take to get rid of it are transitioning, the surgeries, the hormone replacement therapy. And so I think that because of these similarities, I think that both that gender dysphoria should be considered a type of BDD, and also that gender dysphoria is not really the best term for it. Because what gender dysphoria implies is that there's simply a mismatch between a person's gender identity and their body, their biological sex, when I think that's too disembodied. It doesn't reflect physically, because almost all the time the transsexual will change how they look physically. They'll change their hair. They'll try to look like the opposite sex, which makes me think that rather than an identity issue, it's a real physical issue. They see flaws with the way that they are. So this correlation and the terms that I'd like to use instead are terms that Ray Blanchard came up with. He researched a lot about transsexualism, and he has two terms: autoandrophobia for male to female transsexuals, and autogynephilia for female to male transsexuals. And you can infer the meaning from those two terms. I'm just going to be using the former because male to female transsexuals are more common and it's less of a mouthful. So anyways, what I was saying is that this makes sense of two different things. One, why transsexuals are 4 times more likely to have an eating disorder. It makes sense in that both autoandrophobia and eating disorders are the result of BDD. So if you have BDD, you're prone to all of its results, and why transitioning is such an ineffective thing. Because if you look at the way that anorexics are treated, for example, what doctors do is they don't let them starve themselves, even though that's what they'd like to do, because they're delusional. You know, no matter how much weight they lose, they'll never be satisfied with it, and they're just going to continue to be mentally ill, discontent, obsessive, paranoid, and they might kill themselves in the process. And I think the same is for autoandrophobes. You don't let the person manifest the opposite sex, because no matter how much of a smexy woman they look like, the man is still going to have some root mental issue that is there and is haunting him. And I think that explains the whole suicide thing. You know, they get all these surgeries and realize they're still not satisfied and basically feel hopeless, and then just kill themselves. So I think the whole transitioning thing is just APA approved assisted suicide. I think a better approach would be cognitive behavioral therapy, considering that works with people with BDD, and also understanding what makes autoandrophobia arise in the first place. Because it's a man having a negative association with his male traits and thinking that they are impure, I think that for that to be facilitated, there needs to be a negative association created with male traits in his brain. So, I mean, an abusive father figure could bring that about. Your father is the archetypal male adult in your life, and whatever negative traits he has will be reflected on male adults as a whole, and possibly the man will not want to become like that. But also, you know, anti-masculinity messaging in a man's environment, especially from his parents and, you know, authority figures, which is happening. You know, more and more parents have the feminist worldview. You know, schools are changing to fit the progressive modernist worldview. So, you know, if he's getting anti-masculinity messaging, he's going to believe that there's something inherently wrong and oppressive and evil about manhood, and will want to possibly eliminate those traits from himself, or feel very uncomfortable about possessing them, because that makes him an enemy, an aggressor. So, you know, of course, hopefully we can take measures to prevent anti-masculinity messaging from spreading, because that probably has a bunch of other negative side effects as well. So that's it for the autoandrophobia side of things. But there's another cause of transsexualism that people also don't like to talk about, called autogynephilia. And I brought up Ray Blanchard earlier. He was the man who discovered this phenomenon, but it's, as can be implied from the name, it's basically the opposite of autoandrophobia. It's when the man is aroused by the thought of being a woman, rather than repulsed by his own manhood. And that's obviously a metastaphilic thing, because men are supposed to be inherently disgusted by the idea of being a woman. It makes them uncomfortable. So if you are sexually aroused by things that disgust you, that would follow that you would become an autogynephile. So if you want to avoid that, just don't masturbate, watch porn, whatever. I've talked about metastrophilia in the last video. And also worth mentioning is that there can be a mix of autoandrophobia and metastrophilia at the same time. A man can be repulsed by male traits within himself, desiring to become a woman, but also because he is metastaphilic, those things that disgust him, he is aroused by, and is aroused by male traits in other men. So it would basically be a homosexual transsexual. And I've specifically been using the term transsexual instead of transgender, although it's sort of archaic and weirds people out, because transgender is it's been adapted to fit the more modern views on gender and sexuality, you know, the ones that have only been formed in the past 50 years and only have self-report as evidence to back them up. So I really don't want to affirm those theories of the delineation between gender identity and biological sex, and that gender even exists at all, when I'm not sure of these things, and I'm not sure that there's a lot of evidence to prove them. Because gender and gender identity are not really quantifiable things. So of course there's thousands of made-up genders going on if it's just a personal thing that's independent. And it's also those theories are also the justification for why the DSM-5 does not consider gender dysphoria a mental illness. And the reasoning is as follows, because if gender identity and biological sex are completely independent phenomena from each other, then it makes sense for you to be any random gender, no matter what your biological sex is. So if you happen to have a mismatch between the two, it's just natural. It's just a condition. It's not an illness. It's naturally arising, you know. For whatever reason, the made-up, imposed categories of men and women did not stick to you. So you're just, you know, you're whatever. So, yeah, of course, it's not going to be a mental illness. So I don't agree with any of those things, and that's why I don't want to use the terminology that backs them up and affirms them and is on the same ideological page. But I didn't want to just talk about transsexualism, although it is an interesting thing to mention. I also wanted to tackle bisexuality and homosexuality, because those are on the rise too. CDC statistics show that more young adult females than ever before are identifying as bisexual. And at the same time, U.S. Department of Labor statistics show that more mothers are entering the workforce. And it's never really been before that women are en masse workers and part of the labor force. And it's a pretty historically anomalous thing, and not really a thing they're evolutionarily tuned to. And of course, they're statistically higher in trait neuroticism. So I believe that, you know, going to the office for most women is a very stressful experience. And we're talking about not just women, but specifically mothers. So when they come home, they come to neglect their daughters. And that's a problem because, you know, parental neglect leads to a million different pathologies. But in this case, with missing maternal affection, I believe that the daughter will go out and search for that in other women. And it starts off as a sensual, platonic sort of thing. But of course, with behavioral reinforcement, it has the propensity to become a sexual thing that, you know, becomes bisexuality, homosexuality. And also men are experiencing the same sorts of trends, but I think for different reasons. Of course, they're watching pornography and masturbating way more than the women are, and I think that has to do with it, because of course that leads to metastrophilia, and men are inherently disgusted by the idea of homosexuals. So of course, if what disgusts them arouses them, they'll, you know, become homosexuals. But I think also absent fathers may have something to do with it. There was a poll by Gallup done that showed that minorities are way more likely to be LGBT than white people. So, and you know, they're not really known for having exceptional fathers. So, of course, that correlation might have something to do with it. And I bring all of this up because, you know, of course, the problem with transsexuality should be clear to most people. It's a mental illness, cause a lot of trouble, pain. But I think the same thing, in a sense, applies to homosexuality and bisexuality, and that they are problematic. I mean, there's been a bunch of, you know, albeit a little bit old studies done on the behavior of homosexuals, and, you know, of course, a lot of them are alcoholics. They're way more likely to have attempted suicide. I mean, there's a whole Wikipedia page about lesbian domestic abuse. There's tons of promiscuity. I mean, that's responsible for the whole STD crisis and that sort of thing. And to me, looking at all those things, the overall and average unhealthiness of the homosexual lifestyle is very clear. Of course, there's no room for procreation, so it's an inherently hedonistic pursuit, and, you know, of course, hedonism is nowhere near fulfilling. And so I really don't think it's advisable to facilitate and nurture and accept those things. And because the left has sort of a monopoly on compassion, me saying that seems very hateful, because they've redefined compassion and love and kindness to mean to accept people who are, even people who are self-harming, and to enable their mental illness. But sometimes to actually minimize suffering and to make sure that people have better lives, you have to be like harsh and say that you probably shouldn't do this thing. And so that's why it comes off mean when I say, well, you know, it's probably not ideal to be a homosexual or whatever. But it's, you know, it's not because I'm some low IQ redneck who's scared of people who are different than himself. It's because I want to minimize suffering. And these sorts of behaviors, I mean, statistically and reasonably cause more suffering for people. So I think that they should really be avoided. And that's really what I'm here for with most of my videos, is so people don't have to suffer so much on this planet that is increasingly becoming hellish. So yeah, I hope I've accomplished my goal.